Good day, everybody. Thank you for joining us. The tools for modeling for the 2018 Seattle Energy Code and Washington State Energy Code webinar. My name is Armando Verdiel, Technical Development Supervisor with Lighting Design Lab. We're gonna have a great time here for you today with the speakers that we have. But for now, let's go to the next slide. Talk a little bit about the rules of engagement. First thing you'll notice, everybody is muted for today. That is all right. You'll note that the bottom right option on your GoToWebinar dashboard says chat. If you have any questions, comments, things you'd like to say or ask, please write them there. I'm going to be moderating the webinar today. We're going to have a good amount of content to present, but we will have time for questions at the end. May not be able to answer a lot of the questions live, so as to ensure that we get through the content. But please still write your questions because we may hand select solid, relevant, awesome ones and then answer them in the latter part of our presentation today. Quick note, there's going to be a recording of this webinar stored in the Lighting Design Lab website, as well as a handout of the slides. After the webinar, there's going to be a very short 30-second survey of how we did, how was the experience. Please fill it out. Let us know how good we're doing, what can we improve on. Great stuff like that. Go to the next slide, please, Duane. Just a quick note and shout out. Today's webinar has been put together with Seattle City Light's Customer Energy Solutions Division, and we'll see Phoebe Warren speak a little bit about our programs in the latter part. It's being hosted by the Lighting Design Lab, also a good part of Seattle City Light. And we have presenters, Duane Jonlin from the Department of Construction and Inspections, as well as John Kearns from McKinstry. So for now, I'm gonna take my camera off. Duane, please take it away.
Okay, sounds like a deal. Let's, how can I shrink this back? We're going to give you a lot of information. As usual, we tried to pack too much to really fit in the time slot, but just be aware that there's this nifty tip on our website 423 that answers a lot of your questions about how this is done. If you got ideas for things that we might want to do to expand or improve the tip, let me know. That said, we're not talking about how to do energy modeling or how to use Appendix G. That'll be a different webinar sometime. This is about how to deal with Seattle and submitting your projects for approval. So you'll see that in general, for some basic rules, we're following that ASHRAE Appendix G. We're not requiring C406 credits because that's all wrapped up in the Appendix G. And you will need, I think, to demonstrate that you have a UA that's no worse than 10% compared worse than the prescriptive code. And for curtain walls or for any kind of site-built fenestration, you'll need NFRC documentation. Just a couple little things there for you. But for energy modeling, we're talking about using Appendix G. We used to have other options, but those are all completely gone. We have a few things in there that we changed from the Appendix G, and so like what I've highlighted on this slide is that for the on-site renewable, we're changing it from 0.05 to 0.03 in there, and we got a few others there. You'll see that what's underlined here is Seattle stuff. So the state code is requiring a lot of this, and then we're adding a couple things about documentation at the very end there, and a couple more. These are things that came up in the course of our developing our version, that we realized, okay, there's some unanswered questions about yet to be designed, things especially in spec buildings, and yeah, that's how it works out. So wanted to just mention before we get too far that if you're submitting a project using energy modeling, you're encouraged to schedule a pre-op meeting. It's your meeting, and you're paying for it, so you can set up the agenda the way you like. But it's been really valuable to just have everybody in the room for an hour and discuss what it is that you're trying to get done with this model. Anything you're doing that you think might be in question, we can get resolved then, get those meeting minutes published, and it should make your actual permit submittal much more smoothly go. There's that list of mandatory requirements, and that list is instead of the ASHRAE 90.1 list of mandatory requirements. Like I've circled something here that's underlined, that indicates that it's a Seattle in particular amendment to the list that the state has. Also, just in case you have been residing in some other planet for the last several months, we're basing energy modeling on carbon emissions, not on site energy like we used to, or on energy cost like ASHRAE does. And for the moment, we're assuming that electricity is 0.70 pounds per kilowatt hour. This is a very likely changing with this next code. We're gonna, I think, assume 0.44, but that's about to be voted on by the State Building Code Council. And you've got a building performance factor, and this is what compares your the amount of emissions that your building's going to generate with what it would have generated were it built to the ASHRAE 90.1 2004 version. So for that office that I've got circled there, you're doing something outside of Seattle, you'd only be allowed 56% as much emissions from your building, and in Seattle, it's 10% better than that. It's 51% as much emissions. So we've shrunk that 56 back to 51 to recognize that Seattle's prescriptive code is at least that much better. Something to note is that BPF applies to regulated uses, so your HVAC and lighting and water heating, and it leaves out those computers and servers and appliances and of course the lava lamps that you'll find. There's all these things that people plug in that we don't have any control over. So like I said, you're gonna have a building performance factor. I'm sorry, I had that different from the last one. This was now I just saw it was slightly out of date, but we're making Seattle's be 10% better. And what's essential to know about that is that you cannot use modeling to make the building envelope a lot worse than prescriptive level. So at the state level, the backstop is 20% worse, as far as UA. In Seattle, it's only 10% worse that you're allowed. In previously, modeling was used to make building envelopes a lot worse, and since the building envelope lasts for a long time, we wanted to restrict that. That was really fast, but we're getting now to the big part of our show, which is that we're going to have John start to go through actually how this works in the real world. Now, I'm supposed to go to this little spot here and right click and make John the presenter. Wait, give keyboard and mouse. So
Let's see.
does that work for you, John?
Let me test. It doesn't. Oh, there we go. I think.
You just did
Might
that,
be.
so it must be working.
Yeah, might just be delayed or laggy. Well, while that catches up, my name is John Kearns. I work with McKinstry. So I've been with McKinstry for a couple of years. I worked in the energy group, doing ESCO and retrofit work for a couple of years, and then the last few years I've been on the building performance team on the new construction side. So I've got a little experience. I've got experience energy modeling a little bit in eQuest, a little bit more in IES, and have used the compliance form tool, which is what we're going to kind of talk about today on a couple projects, one that's actually gone through permit and everything, and then some that are going to be submitted soon. So a little agenda, kind of introduce or remind us about the differences in documentation requirements for Appendix G. We'll talk about the compliance form, and then we'll do a high-level demo, kind of just highlighting, it'll be a quick click through, but kind of highlighting the Washington and Seattle specific edits that have been made to the tool and how that is kind of important and interesting and useful for code compliance. So diving in, Appendix G documentation. So as Duane said, we've kind of shifted to these new standards, 90.1 2019 for Seattle Energy Code. And with these new standards, we've got new documentation requirements. So in the past, for Seattle Energy Code TBP projects, we would kind of look to the Appendix E reporting format and just build reports based off that. Now that we have this new standard, we're not going to look at Appendix E anymore. We're actually going to look directly towards the standard, which kind of has this documentation requirements list. And the tool we're talking about today tries to account for most of these requirements here. It's not going to be able to capture everything in the list, but it does a pretty good job, or it does a great job at capturing most of them. So what is the compliance form? It's an Excel-based documentation tool for the standard 90.1 Appendix G. It works for 2016 and 2019, which is super useful for Washington and Seattle Energy Code. And yeah, so it's kind of just this Excel tool. It kind of sits between our design documents and our energy model, just documenting both the inputs and outputs as we go along the process. So super beneficial for the energy modelers and the code reviewers. We'll talk about some of the benefits a little bit later. But you know, when is it required? So for 2018 Washington Energy Code, we're saying it's strongly encouraged and to check with your local AHJ. It's not in 2018 Washington Energy Code prescriptively required. But that being said, it's kind of becoming the standard for documentation for 90.1. If you kind of watch any training or anything about 90.1, they're starting to reference it. And I think it really facilitates the review process for the code reviewer and the modeler. So for those reasons, we kind of expect you know, most AHJs to kind of adopt it and expect it with permit submissions. And is kind of a warning that the tool itself is pretty big and complex and takes a significant time commitment to kind of fill out fully. So just coordinating with the AHJ, it's not something you want to figure out right before you go in for permit that you need to fill out just because of the time commitment associated with it. For 2018 Seattle Energy Code, it is required. You can see that tip 423 that Duane mentioned before. So pretty straightforward there. And in 2021 for Washington Energy Code, there is a change proposal to make the tool mandatory. So looking forward, lots of use of the tool. The tool was developed by the Department of Energy, Building Energy Codes, and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, PNNL. They did a great job at condensing Appendix G, the guidance on proposed and baseline energy modeling, and getting that all into one Excel workbook is a pretty big task. And I think they did a great job at that. It's a really well QC'd tool. And then on top of that, they've just been super good partners as far as updating the tool. If you have any recommendations how to make the tool work better, or if you see a spot where a calculation is not happening correctly, just reaching out to them. They get versions updated and are constantly dropping new versions, which kind of leads me to where to find the tool. So typically I just Google compliance form Appendix G and it pops up first thing on this Energy Codes website, but I've got it listed here as well. You can also find it on the Seattle Energy Code website under the Forms tab. It will link you back to the Energy Code website. Definitely check these websites when you're starting a new project just to make sure you have the newest version, because they are continually building and improving on the tool. And then today will be a pretty high level click through on the compliance form, but if you are interested in more detailed trainings, the Energy Codes websites has a couple free trainings for the tool if you are interested. And then additional resources and tools for Washington and Seattle Energy Code. Just got some links here. Like Duane said, there's the 10% UA limit and 20% UA limit for Washington Energy Code. That's not going to happen in this compliance form tool. The calculation will actually happen through the envelope web tool, which can be found there. And then for code reviewers, I've got this link to the Appendix G submittal review manual, which is just kind of guidance on reviewing Appendix G projects. I think just wanted to highlight that most of the takeaways from this review manual have been kind of worked into the compliance form. So that's just another reason we think people will like using the tool. So before we go into the actual demo, just wanted to summarize what we kind of found is the biggest benefits of the tool. And mainly it's just the standardization of this 90.1 Appendix G process, which is kind of new for a lot of us in Washington and Seattle. First off, documenting the inputs consistently and clearly across different projects is super helpful, especially with baseline systems that don't have drawings that we can reference. Just having that kind of standardized documentation format is super helpful. And then with 90.1 model Appendix G modeling, there are multiple calculations that kind of happen every single project. If that's like a window to wall ratio calculation or a fan power calculation. And maybe most importantly, the compliance calculation for 90.1 isn't super straightforward. So this workbook has kind of taken all those calculations, kind of created them, QC'd them, make sure they work. So it's kind of nice that we don't have to worry too much about building these calculators anymore. And then finally, Washington and Seattle have specific energy code updates. PNNL has done a great job at integrating those updates into the workbook, and that just makes it easier to use for documentation and compliance checking. So now we can dive into the tool. I'm going to kind of talk about some just kind of tips of using the tool first, and then I've got, I guess when I gave this presentation initially to some team members, some of the feedback I got was that I was clicking around in the Excel workbook, zooming around a lot, and I made everyone nauseous. So I've tried to just take some screenshots from the workbook and put them here, and I'll try to minimize clicking around and zooming too much to avoid any nausea. But we'll kind of talk about some tips and tricks for using the workbook, and then I've got a slide for each tab in the workbook. And not going to go into the details of each input, but just wanted to give context for how big the compliance tool actually is. Give you guys just a little context on what it will be like to fill out. So when you go to that Energy Code website, you'll download the compliance form. It'll come with two files. One's a blank compliance form. One's a sample compliance form that's fully filled out. So as you're going along and you get kind of confused or lost, you can always check back to that project example as a good kind of reference for what things are supposed to look like. And then as far as Excel settings, I think when you download this tool, the formula bar and the headings are hidden. And for me, it was super helpful to kind of re-show those because it's an Excel-based tool. Everything's kind of calculations, and you can kind of track back and like look under the hood how the workbook is working. So that kind of was just a little advice or guidance I would give when you open this thing up for the first time. So the tool itself has a bunch of tabs, and they're all different disciplines, and you're documenting your inputs, but it's kind of, it's like tabular documentation style. So the envelope tab will have 5 tables that document all the envelope inputs that go into the model. But the tool kind of relies on this color kind of visual cues on when you need to fill things out or what's been changed. So I've got this formatting key. It's kind of small to read right now, but you can find it in the instructions tab on like kind of what the colors mean, what the different fonts mean. I guess the main thing, if you look at this red box that I've got circled, the yellow color is cells that you need to input, and then the pink cells are cells that auto-populate based on what you've input. And then in the pink cells, if you need to override something that's auto-populated, it might auto-populate to the wrong thing. You can totally do that, and that will definitely happen in the workbook. The font will just change colors to that kind of dark, bold yellow. And that's just kind of a visual cue to yourself and any code or submittal reviewers that cell has been overridden. Totally okay. So typically you have your table, which has documentation stuff, and then at the bottom of the table, in this second red box that I've included, there's kind of just a notes text box, and you can kind of just add some narrative in there why you needed to change things. You can also include stuff in this notes box that's like hard to capture in the tables. Sometimes capturing, control sequences or things like that are hard to capture in tabular form. You can throw them into the notes columns. Wanted to highlight, so throughout the workbook, there are these little question mark buttons that you can click on. This is also one of the main things I thought was super helpful about the workbook. When you click on the button, it kind of gives you some guidance on what the cell's asking for and why it's asking for that, and it's referencing Appendix G. So it's just kind of another source and interpretation and guidance on how to do Appendix G modeling. So you can kind of add that to your list of resources. You've got actual Appendix G, your user guides, your reference guides, and now you've got the compliance form to kind of use as an interpretation on how to do our models. I'll take a sip of water right for a second. Okay, so these are all the tabs that are in the workbook. They come in this sequence. So at the first, you've got your project setup tabs. Definitely do these first because some of the selections that you make on these tabs will kind of cascade throughout the workbook. So you kind of get your project set up in those tabs, and then you go into your project model input tabs. So these are your different disciplines. You've got envelope, lighting, exterior lighting, HVAC, service water heating, plug loads, renewable energy. And that's just documenting the inputs in between your design documents, inputs going into the energy model. And then once you've got your energy model running and you've got results that you like, there's some outputs tab. So you're taking data from your energy model, putting it into the compliance tool, and then it's doing the compliance calculation for you. And then you've got a couple QC tabs. So this is where that submittal review manual that I mentioned before, most of the checks that manual recommends have been integrated into the workbook, and it does all of these quality control checks automatically, just making sure your model inputs and outputs are kind of within expected parameters. And yeah, you've got your inputs and outputs in the same workbook, so it's able to do a lot of cool quality control checks there. So yeah, we're gonna just I've got a slide for each one of these tabs. I'm gonna stop on some of the kind of Washington, Seattle specific tabs, but some of them we'll kind of click through quickly. So just diving into it, let's see. General information. Oops. Is this showing end of slideshow, Duane? I'm not sure. We lost some slides. I'll let you take over. Yeah, that looks good.
Do you remember
Yeah.
which slide number you're on here?
We were a little earlier than this, probably in the 20s.
Not seen this happen before.
No, yeah, no problem. Few more, probably like 25.
Okay.
Yeah, go into that one.
All right. So let's come on.
Mhm.
Okay, let's hope that this works now. Does it work? Yeah. All right.
As a quick one, if there's still any technical things to be worked on, quick question for either Duane or John. Is there a standard process for reporting spreadsheet issues or limitations of the spreadsheet to anyone in WSEC or SEC for application G?
Yeah, I can forward them to the authors of this tool at PNNL. I should say that the last 3 of these that I got, it turned out somebody was, well, obviously somebody hadn't already had John's lecture here, and so they didn't necessarily know that they needed to click on a tab first or something like that. So what sometimes seems to be a software error is sometimes an organic unit failure.
And at the beginning of this workbook, there's that instructions tab, and it's the tool itself is documented really well, and I think there's also some contact information in that instructions tab as well.
Solid, thank you.
Okay, you know what's happening, John, is that for some reason the slideshow function is weirding out. So I'm gonna have to just have it on this.
Yeah, can zoom it out.
We'll move this over as far as we can. And so it's not quite as pretty, but it will get us there.
Works for me.
And are we on
24?
24. So we'll just go from there.
Sweet. Thank you. So yeah, we're just going to kind of click through the slides. This is the general information tab, definitely the first one you want to do. So this first red box that I've got, it's a drop down. You can pick 2018 Seattle Energy Code, or you can pick 2018 Washington Energy Code. That's going to auto populate some stuff in the workbook. Specifically, that compliance path is going to change to 2019 if you're Seattle, or it's going to change to 2016 if you're Washington. And then it's just going to ask for some general project information. Another kind of important one is your simulation program. So I've got eQuest selected here. So yeah, just general project information gets filled out here. This building areas table at the bottom is important because your building performance factors, as Duane was kind of showing earlier, is dependent on your building type and your building area. So that's going to play a big part in your compliance calculation. So just making sure that that building area tab is filled out correctly before you look at any results. So yeah, just going on to the next slide, this 2018 Seattle Energy Code is one of those tabs that pops up when you select Seattle Energy Code. This is just asking, have you checked that your proposed total UA is within 10% of your allowed total UA? So you're just going to take the output of your envelope web tool results and kind of put them in here and just make sure you're within that 10%. It'll show 20% if you're doing the Washington Energy Code. So then just clicking to the next slide, we've got kind of contact information, basic stuff, dashboard to the next slide. This slide is just ensuring that you as the energy model and the design professional have done their best at documenting all the inputs and kind of reviewed everything in the workbook, just making sure that this is all checked off as complete before you submit your application. Next slide, energy sources. So this one's kind of important. So yeah, like Duane said, so Washington and Seattle Energy Code, our compliance is based on emissions rather than cost, which is what 90.1 does, or energy, what we used to do. This energy sources table, when you select Washington or Seattle will just auto-populate with the correct electricity and natural gas emissions rates from that table that Duane showed. It will do the correct conversions and stuff. So don't have to do anything here. It's just nice that that's kind of been taken care of within the workbook. At the bottom, we've got this table 2 uniform charges, and I've kind of just left it blank. So this is, I guess, just another bit of guidance as you're filling out the workbook. Just a reminder that it was built for 90.1 compliance. And since we're using it for Washington and Seattle Energy Code, there's some parts of the workbook that is not applicable to us. So since our compliance is not a function of cost savings or anything, you don't need to fill out the uniform charges table. And that's just kind of, if you see stuff in the workbook that's not applicable to us but is applicable to 90.1, you can just leave it blank, and then in the notes section below kind of respond why it's not applicable. For the most part, when you select Washington and Seattle Energy Code, the workbook kind of goes through and hatches out areas that are 90.1 requirements, but not Washington, Seattle requirements. But there are a few cases here and there where it's not fully hatched out. So in those cases, I would just recommend leaving it blank. Moving forward, you've got your operating schedules tab. You can document schedules and set points here. Now we're getting kind of into the model inputs, disciplines, your envelope, lighting, HVAC tabs. So I will click pretty quickly through these. It's just that tabular documentation. I will say I've only got like one table shotted for each one of these tabs, but there's many tables below each one of these tabs. So just considering that when you're thinking about the size of the workbook. So let's see, we've got envelope, some more envelope. Here's kind of that example where stuff gets hatched out if you select Washington or Seattle Energy Code. In this case, it's for U values. Envelope, infiltration calculation, the nice standardized calculation. Kind of get into lighting, defining the space types and building types in your model. Your lighting counts, this is kind of where you define the lighting power in the building. You've got a tab that kind of summarizes that lighting count tab. Exterior lighting documentation, your proposed, now we're getting into proposed HVAC. So this is one of the bigger, beefier tabs, I would say. You know, in the table of contents, you can see there are 7 or 8 or I guess there's more than 7 because there's some subtables, but a lot of tables to fill out on the HVAC side. For the proposed tab, you're kind of pulling from your design documents. The baseline HVAC tab is going to be very similar. I would say this one's probably maybe more important though than the proposed tab, just because you don't have, as an energy modeler and as a code reviewer, you don't have those design documents to kind of reference back towards. So making sure you do a really good job on this baseline tab documenting how you're modeling your systems. This tab also has a ton of those question mark help buttons, so a lot of good guidance on how to do modeling. And then there's also a fan power calculator, which is super helpful for the baseline system on this tab. Moving forward.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Back on lighting, typically nobody's finished designing the lighting by the time the modeler is having to do this model. And so how do you handle undesigned systems like that?
Yeah, so let me go back to this lighting count tab. So the way, and I guess this is also kind of a lesson, specifically this lighting tab, the way it's set up is it's got, each row is the zone in your energy model, and then kind of across the top up here is your lighting schedule. So you have your different lighting fixtures and the wattages per fixture, and you kind of tally up. I have 10 of fixture A in this zone, and I have 1 of fixture C in this second zone. And then off to the right, it kind of tallies it all up based off what you put in here. Will do your proposed and baseline lighting powers. So this isn't, I would say, I'm guessing this isn't how most people document their interior lighting for their models. So just kind of knowing how this workbook works and operates, I wouldn't recommend, fully replacing your own documentation style for when you're doing your inputs, how you're inputting data into your energy model, but kind of getting familiar with what this workbook asks for, and then trying to make the transition to copy data into this workbook as easy as is kind of what we did. And then as far as the TI, documenting TI lighting, I think so in Seattle, we can reference our Seattle LPDs for those spaces. And what we've done is kind of put a row for the TI undesigned lighting spaces kind of as one giant zone just for documentation, kind of added up all that area in our energy model, and then put in an LPD just so that the proposed lighting gets kind of tallied up correctly, so that the workbook's reflecting what's actually in the energy model, if that kind of makes sense.
Thanks.
Yep. Let's see. I think we were, baseline HVAC we just talked about. Surface water heating is very similar to the HVAC tabs. You've got your plug, process, and other loads tab. So the main thing on this tab I just wanted to highlight is in 90.1, 2016, and 2019, there is some guidance on claiming savings on regulated commercial refrigerators and freezers, motors, and elevators. So 90.1 kind of stipulates how you do that calculation. The compliance form has kind of built calculators that align with that guidance. So if you have those loads in your building, you can kind of come to this tab and see how the calculation is supposed to happen for savings for those different end uses. You've got a tab for renewable energy where you can document how much PV is in your design. And that's basically all the inputs. So yeah, lots of tabular inputs for how you're modeling, and then you kind of move into the output. So you've finished your energy model, you've got results, you want to put it into the compliance form to check what your compliance is at. So depending on what energy model simulator you're using, I had eQuest selected at the beginning. It's going to create a tab called results from whatever your simulation program is. So for eQuest, they make it pretty simple. You just go into your parms.csv file. So that file is just generated whenever you run energy model simulations, and you literally just paste the data into this spreadsheet, make it super easy. Most of the energy modeling programs have a tab similar to this. I think the main one that doesn't is IES. You kind of have to more manually put your data in. So once you update this tab, just straight up copying, pasting into those rows, you go over to your compliance calculation tab. In this first red box that I've got highlighted, populate table 2 with information. You just click that, and then the Excel workbook does its magic and pulls all the data from that results from eQuest into this table. So if you are not using eQuest or one of the other supported energy modeling softwares, you kind of have to put your energy model output report results manually into this table. So how the table is set up, if you do need to do that, you have your end uses along the left, whether or not they're regulated or unregulated. And for the compliance calculation for 90.1, this is a very important column. We're only claiming savings or getting savings on regulated loads. So making sure this is kind of in alignment with what 90.1 is recommending. You've got some just energy units, and then you input your baseline and proposed energy, and then your baseline and proposed demand. So once you kind of get all that information in, you either import it from the eQuest tab or you manually put it in. You'll kind of scroll down the page. It's doing a bunch of calculations, but you'll get to the bottom and it will have this building performance factor summary. So this is kind of where it's looking back to that initial general information setup tab where it's looking at the building types and building areas. And then it's going to pull a building performance factor in the emissions column. I've got that boxed red, and if you have Washington and Seattle selected, it will pull the correct emissions factors for whatever code compliance you're doing. And then it goes into that compliance calculation, which, as you can see, it's got kind of a bunch of rows. It's not a super straightforward calculation, but really what you're looking at is this last line. So since we're Seattle, we're doing it based off emissions. We're not going to look at the cost or site source energy. Those switch to NA, and we just look at that last bottom right value. So we're at 3.3% for this project. So the project complies with energy code. If it was less than 3%, or if it was less than the 0%, this bottom box would turn red, and you'd have some more modeling and design to do. So that's kind of the process. Yeah, for documenting all your inputs and then doing your model, taking the results from the model and then plugging it in to the compliance form. It just does that compliance calculation automatically.
If you're interested in the site site energy or something, is it possible to uncheck that NA and have it total it, or does it only do the
my first thought was you could go and change the compliance pathway at the very beginning to, like, I don't know if it calculates. You could maybe change the compliance pathway at the beginning to just 90.1, and it might not NA those things, but then it's going to change the building performance factors.
Okay, never mind.
Building performance factors. So that might be a little bit of a workaround, but you can take, so it's kind of calculating in the middle of the table before it hits NA. It's calculating the numbers that you need to do the calculation. So after you've got the kind of the PBP, the PBP, NRE, the BB, UEC, you can look to 90.1 and just plug those variables into the compliance calculation and do it for yourself at that point. It's like half the calculations happening if you're interested in those as well.
Thanks.
Cool, so you've got inputs and outputs in there. Now you kind of move into the QC section of the workbook. So this tab, the energy performance summary, you're just comparing your baseline and proposed models to benchmarks, just kind of checking if any of your end uses are out of whack. And then your quality controls check. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier. The review manual recommends a bunch of checks, and the workbook has kind of integrated those in here. So the workbook's going to go through each one of the tabs that we filled out and generate these automatic checks, checking if the parameters that we've input or if the outputs, how they kind of work together. If anything looks way out of whack or way out of parameter, you gave a weird value, it will automatically generate a QC flag. And those look like this on the next slide. So if you kind of just scroll down the tab, it's got all these QC checks. So if you fail something, it'll kind of tell you why you failed it. And you just want to kind of go through this tab and where you fail things, make sure you respond to why you failed it. Maybe it makes sense that you failed it. You have a super efficient design or something that it's not accounting for, or maybe you have an input or documentation error that needs to be resolved. So just making sure when you're doing your project to go through that quality controls check and respond to everything before you go in for permit. And then going to the last and final tab, the submittal checklist. So kind of alluded to it earlier, but the compliance form, when you go in for permit, is not going to be the only thing you need to submit. If you look at the Appendix G documentation requirements, the form checks off most of the stuff, but there are still some things that it can't capture. So this list just kind of tries to generate a list of things that you also need to provide. So just reviewing this checklist, making sure you're submitting what it's asking for, and if you're not, giving a reason for not submitting that item. So that's kind of the whole workbook. It is pretty beefy. I guess I just wanted, me personally, using the workbook, I love not having to create compliance calculations each project. I can kind of just focus more on the actual energy modeling, the inputs, and not worry so much about QCing Excel tools. So that for me was super helpful. Hey, Armando.
Hey, John, I have a few questions, and I really appreciate everyone's just putting a good amount of questions and comments on the chat. Keep them coming. Won't be able to address all of them, but we'll be able to address a few here and a good amount at the end of the presentation. Couple of quick ones. First one, is it possible to input the post-processing result into the compliance form?
Can you repeat the
Sure.
question?
Is it possible to input the post-processing result into the compliance form? From Ryan Guan.
I'm not totally sure I understand the question. I guess.
Okay.
I can. Yeah. Why don't you just ask for a little further?
Sure. Ryan, if you can write a bit more description to it, and if not, we can get to it offline for sure. Gonna pick one, maybe two more.
There is a section in the workbook to account for like exceptional calculations that if you can't explicitly model in your energy model and you need to model in a side calc, like an Excel calc or something, and you want to add that onto your results, there is a section to account for that in the workbook, if that's what it's asking, if that's what he was asking about.
Yes, that is what he was asking about. Thank you. He was coming back in. Have another one. Says for R2, 3 stories or less, the baseline service water heating system is the same as proposed, so there's no savings credit awarded for high efficiency central heat pump water systems. Does that ring true?
Wait a second. Somebody is talking about a multifamily that's 3 stories or less?
Correct. That's
not under the jurisdiction of this code. That's in the residential energy code. So
that's a simpler answer. And I think that there was a lighting question already answered. I see it. All right, we'll carry on, and I'll flag a couple for the end of the year. Thank you, guys.
Cool. Yeah, I liked the calculation standardization. And then I guess just kind of a recap on the workflow. Now that everyone's kind of seen each tab, just a reminder that we didn't see every table in each tab. So it is a pretty beefy, long workbook. But with that being said, I would just recommend, if it's your first time using it, to give yourself plenty of time just to get comfortable with how to navigate around the tool, what the tool is asking for. As you kind of, the first pass through the tool can take a little bit of time, but as I've continued to use it, the process has gotten like exponentially faster to get it updated, and then the value of just the form kind of gets better and better as the time it takes to fill it out reduces. So just kind of, I guess, guidance, give yourself some time the first time you're going through this thing, but it will get faster to fill out with more use. And then one kind of just last reminder that when you go in for permit, just submit the compliance form. Kind of fill the compliance form out, review that submittal checklists, make sure you're doing everything in the submittal checklist, then kind of go back to the actual Appendix G requirements and read through those and make sure that you've kind of addressed everything. So, some stuff that's not in the form are things like space and system maps for your energy model, NFRC reports for glazing assemblies you can't include in the form, so that needs to be submitted as well. Site shading analysis needs to be submitted. So those are just some examples, not everything, but just kind of double checking that you've done your diligence on supporting or providing all the required documentation.
John, before we go on, I've got a couple for you. One,
yeah.
For somebody who's already been through this form 2 or 3 times, what are you guessing is the range of hours that would require to do this whole thing for, say you're doing an elementary school or a 5-story office building, like just some order of magnitude?
For someone that's already filled it out and doesn't have to go.
Yeah, it's not their first time through. It's not their first rodeo.
Yeah, I guess let me think on an actual hour commitment, but I guess the way it's kind of worked for us, and obviously for the complexity of the design and size of the project, and I guess the actual person filling it out, those variables can like greatly range how long it takes to fill out. We've kind of, the compliance form for us, if you kind of go back to the workflow, hasn't fully replaced documentation tools that we still kind of maintain for envelope lighting, mechanical stuff. And that's just because when you're in the compliance form, there's so much, formatting that's like kind of built in the tool. You can't kind of add columns or add rows and delete things. So for us, it doesn't fully replace the other input documentation that we're doing. We've just kind of modified our input tools so that they easily transfer into the compliance form. So we're kind of like already doing the documentation and have kind of tailored our tools just to kind of copy and paste into this thing. So for us, that's greatly shrinking the amount of time it takes to document this stuff. I guess I would kind of say it takes the same amount of time as it would take to like actually document this stuff for energy modeling. It's just in this other format. So however long it takes, if you're going to use this as your sole documentation format, I don't think it would take longer than whatever process you were using before. But then it's how fast you can integrate it. I'd maybe at least a week though to go through all the entire form, all of the drawings and all the forms. So
thanks. I was guessing that a lot of people had the same question on their minds. And
yeah.
Finally, before we maybe go on to some other questions, Carolyn mentioned that you were doing a little project for NIA to sort of go through this state and Seattle workbooks and see how they work. What's going to be the output from that study you're doing, and what are you, just preliminarily, what are you finding?
Good question. I guess my kind of summary of that was just kind of talking to them about, is this tool valuable? Is it useful in the whole energy modeling process for Appendix G? And I kind of had the same takeaways as what I talked about earlier, like the benefits, if we kind of, actually, I'm not going to go all the way back to those slides, but just the benefits of the standardization of the 90.1 process, I think is just kind of going to lead to more accurate energy models and models that have been QC'd better, and just kind of getting everyone on the same page on how to do this new standard, because maybe a lot of us weren't doing it before with how our energy code modeling was kind of guided. So I think they were kind of polling and trying to get people's experiences with it, and I kind of gave a similar response to what we talked about today.
Thanks. And before we go on to Phoebe, Armando, was there another question or two there?
Yes, and Duane, this may be better an offline one. This question came in for the 2018 SEC C407 project. The SDCI 2018 Building Envelope Form, which is used to demonstrate envelope compliance, does not have an option to show that the UA falls under the prescriptive plus 10% buffer. The printout, therefore, shows the message, the envelope UA does not comply, which may confuse code reviewers. Is there a way to handle this? It seems more like troubleshooting with the tool itself.
Yeah, good question. And we've been seeing that because you're at 105% or something like that of allowable. And it may be possible to get that fixed. I'll take a look at that.
There you have it. And if anything, feel free. If you don't see your question answered, please feel free to email lightingdesignlab@seattle.gov. We can ensure that we reach out to the presenters and address any questions offline if we cannot address them here. I have a question on lighting. Do we need to enter the interior lighting power by each zone, or can we group zones with the same space type or building type? Can zones be grouped but with the same space type or building type in the tool?
Yeah, since it's like an Excel workbook, you kind of can group things together. That's kind of like how we did our TI zones. Since the TI zones weren't actually designed, we said all the TI zones, if you group them together, would all be at the Seattle Energy Code LPD, and kind of documented it that way, just so that we kind of accounted for all the lighting power in the tool, but it wasn't zone by zone.
Solid. Have one more that I'll ask now, and we can move on to our customer energy solutions section. For 90.1, requires rotation of standard design unless, per PRM, it is site constrained or glazing differs by less than 5% by orientation. I don't see in the Excel tool a place to document HVAC sizing for each baseline rotation. Thought there is an input for energy of each rotation. If rotations are modeled, what HVAC capacity or efficiencies is entered into the tool? Should it be the average of all the runs?
Yeah, that is a really good question, because the outputs, there's a space to do the different rotations for the outputs. But on the HVAC tabs, the baseline tabs, it only has one capacity input and doesn't have options for the different sizing runs. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. For how to document, so I need to kind of go back to the Appendix G and read closely to see if it has any guidance on how to document that.
Right.
I think starting with the actual orientation of the building would be a fair start. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the actual answer to that.
Very solid. And David Reddy, thank you for the question. Feel free to follow up with us offline. Good one to go. All right. Thanks, guys. We'll again save a few for the latter parts.
Go ahead and click forward, John. There we go. Phoebe, you're on.
Well, for those of you who are attempting not only to meet the energy code, but beat the Seattle Energy Code or the Washington State Energy Code, Seattle City Light can offer funding toward that undertaking. And if you're going through C407, we can use the output from the compliance form as inputs to our calculator of funding. That work is not yet completed on our end. So this will be talking about a future that hopefully is only a couple weeks away. But anyway, once you've completed the review by SDCI of your 90.1 Appendix G compliance form, and the SDCI has approved it, then we take that approved version and extract the data to calculate Seattle City Light funding. Next slide, please. So I wasn't sure when I put this together how much you'd be seeing the actual form during the previous presentations, but you've seen a lot of it. And as John mentioned, this so-called form is a workbook with many tabs, and the Seattle City Light calculator inputs come from two of the tabs, the exceptional calcs and the compliance calcs, a couple of the tables in each. Next slide, please. So the calculator on our end will be filled out by Seattle City Light once we have the SDCI approved version of the compliance form. And the calculator, which is roughly 1 or 2 pages long, will have green cells where the City Light employee will fill in the data extracted from the compliance form to produce a savings calculation. Next slide, please. So the basics of how we do this, is we're going to look at upstream intermediate calculations of kilowatt hours. So we're not basing our funding on carbon, but the calculations presented in the compliance form have the intermediate values, and we'll use those annual consumption data. And then if there's anything that has been left out of the total building performance analysis and is eligible for City Light funding on a measure-by-measure basis, then the funding from Seattle City Light equals the funding based on the compliance form data plus any measure-specific calculations, such as for appliances that would apply to the building. Next slide, please. So if you are interested in seeking Seattle City Light funding for going beyond the requirements of the Seattle Energy Code, you can contact us either going to Google under Seattle City Light Tools and Resources, or you can contact our so-called energy advisors, or you can contact any of the energy management analysts that do this kind of work. And I provided my email in case you want to contact me directly. Next, please. So the process is going to be initiated ideally for each project early on in the design. It's ideal that the developer would fill out an online application as early as possible. And that way you get an energy management analyst assigned to the project from Seattle City Light, and you get to vest the project under the current program funding levels. The good thing about having an energy management analyst assigned is they can work out any questions you have early on, and it'll help you figure out which aspects of the design might be eligible for Seattle City Light funding. And that way, as you proceed through the project, you can decide which measures to protect through value engineering and so on with consideration for funding. So that's preferably early in the design, get someone assigned, put in an application, and figure out roughly which elements of the design would be eligible for City Light funding. And then once the total building performance analysis and study and compliance form are all approved by SDCI, then City Light gets a copy of their approved version from SDCI, and we calculate the funding amount. An agreement is signed then between Seattle City Light and the developer. And once the project is completed, Seattle City Light goes out to the building to check that any major elements influencing the results of the total building performance have been installed more or less as modeled and are fully operational. We don't do nitpicky review, but we check that the major assumptions are consistent with what was actually built, and then we issue a check. Next, please.
Phoebe, could I ask you a question on that side?
Yeah.
So would the team essentially do a model first without the above code things that you're going to fund, and then do it again with those things included to show what the savings would be?
They don't need to do that for our sake, but they might want to do it for their own sake. There are basically two ways to figure out how far you're going to get beyond code, and therefore how much you'd be eligible for from Seattle City Light. One way is to simply tell the design team, listen, we're going to meet this code without taking credit for the heat pump water heater system because we want to get the full $350 or $500 per living unit that might otherwise be available. And that way, then the design team has to get through code with the energy code without that design element. And it puts a lot of pressure on the design team to really go beyond code. A lot of design teams aren't willing to take that approach, and I don't blame them because there's so much uncertainty as to what's going to happen as the project is reviewed by SDCI. But that's the way to really defend funding from City Light. But another way to do it is to just put all of the measures that you're allowed to put into the total building performance, allowed by SDCI to put into the building performance, and then see how far it goes beyond. And the modeler may want, for the purpose of internal discussion in the design with the design team, to do a few runs to figure out how far they're likely to get beyond code and by what means, but that's not something City Light needs to be involved in. We don't require that. It's a good idea. I mean, obviously, any preliminary analysis early in design to figure out how to save energy is a good idea. And then if there's been an energy analysis comparing two different routes, City Light is happy to use those numbers and come up with a rough estimate of funding. There are a number of consultants in town that call us early on and say, this is what we know about what we're considering for these two options. What do you think the funding amount, the difference in funding would be? And we'll do our best to come up with something.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So tips for success. We say this often, and it's worth repeating that getting to Seattle City Light early in the project is a good idea for vesting, interpretation of gray areas, and finding out what's new with our program. Our program, like the code, changes over time, and so it's worthwhile to get an idea of what's going to apply to that particular project. And then the second tip for success is to do rough estimates early in the design, just as Duane emphasized, to see whether or not pursuit of our funding is worth the trouble. As with a lot of work on building design and construction, the benefit per hour invested goes up typically as the size of the project goes up, but it also goes up as the percent savings that you're targeting beyond code goes up. Now, I understand very humbly that it's hard to even meet our code, much less go beyond our code. And so I wouldn't even be talking to you about this, except that, the city of Seattle does have some amazing developers and amazing designers, amazing contractors, and hats off to those of you who continue to target performance beyond code. And then finally, the third tip for success is to remember that when you're doing value engineering calculations, you'll want to throw in the impact on City Light funding on the off chance that the value engineering might actually be driving up the net cost. Next, please. So I just want to go briefly over some other changes to our program. So the first change we've already discussed is the fact that we're coming up with the 2018 SEC Seattle City Light funding calculator for the C407 path. Probably a lot of you in the audience have already seen how we've handled that for previous codes, and it's going to be quite similar. Just the calculator that we've drafted is now under review by PNNL, the people who wrote the compliance form, and just to make sure that what we're doing is accurate and reasonable. So as I say, I'm hoping that in a couple of weeks we'll have that tool ready, and then certainly we'll be ready to test it on a few projects before too long. So you might be curious about some of the other changes going on in our program. As of January 1st, not only were there some major changes in the Seattle Energy Code around heat pump water heaters, but there were also changes to the Seattle Energy Conservation Funding Program. In particular, we no longer fund energy conservation and lighting for new construction, either in commercial buildings or multifamily. And there are some exceptions there if you could end up modeling those savings in the total building performance work done for C407 permitting. Then we could cover it. Normally, of course, you don't, because the lighting isn't yet designed. So I only mention that in sort of a hypothetical sense. And then also there are some funds now being funneled through the point of sale, or so what we call upstream paths of funding for some types of lighting and some types of HVAC. So when I say no longer funded, this may turn out not to be as blanket a statement as it appears at first, but it is quite a change. And then similarly for Built Smart, we're no longer funding whole house fans low flow shower heads or heat pumps for space heat through our Build Smart program, unless it's part of a whole building funding. And one of the whole building funding approaches is the one we're discussing today. There are a couple others that are supported by the Bonneville Power Administration, and I'm happy to talk to you about those as well on specific projects. And heat pumps are like lighting being supported now by City Light, not only through whole building modeling approaches, but also at point of sale. So that's just a sort of brief overview about the changes that happened for applications that came in to our programs after January 1st of this year. So that's it. And thanks to John and Duane for excellent presentations. And thanks to the Lighting Design Lab for helping us organize this.
Thank you, Phoebe. John, I think we can go on to Armando to wrap us up here.
Yes. Have a few more minutes here. Thank you everybody for their part. It's been a fun one, very educational, a lot of information. I think we had some space for a few more questions before we wrapped up. If you guys want to come as a panelist, Phoebe, John, Duane on camera, we can hang out here for a few minutes. First question that I see, actually for Phoebe. Phoebe, is there a minimum percentage or absolute kilowatt hour savings needed via the C407 approach in order to be eligible for incentives?
No. In the past, we've required the percent beyond prescriptive that was embedded, hardwired into the code itself, 7, 10, 13%, depending on the C406 selections. But since the code no longer ties C407 to C406, and because the code no longer has these minimum percents beyond prescriptive, neither do we. It'll just be linear.
Very nice. Very nice. Question from Aaron Woodlatch mentions disclaimer. I emailed Duane about this previously, but I believe we're good for the group here. For the 2018 Seattle Energy Code projects, there is no way an AppG compliance form to show C412 trade-off and C407 compliance path. What is the best way to handle this when submitting for a permit? The AppG compliance form to show C412 trade-off and C407 compliance path.
Right. So C412 is the solar energy requirement, and as you might have noticed, you have some other options to not do the solar and to donate it to an affordable housing project or something. And so at this point, it would be a letter appended to to your application explaining and what you have done and verifying it with some verification that it did happen.
Very solid. Thank you, Duane. Question for me, will this presentation be posted anywhere for reference? Yes, lightingdesignlab.com. We have our educations tab on our website. The recording of this presentation will be uploaded there, as well as a handout of the slides for your information. Next up, we have Eric Knowles asking, is there an error on the infiltration tab when it states that the baseline infiltration rate should be 1 CFM by square foot of building envelope area? I received a review comment that stated that baseline infiltration rate should be identical to the proposed infiltration rate. And again, so if it's a very specific one, another one we could take offline, but if there's a set answer we can provide, yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I think there is specific requirements for Appendix G to claim a better infiltration rate in your proposed building, that it has to be measured before you claim a different infiltration rate. So you'd have to be like through construction and have a measured infiltration rate. So I think for a lot of compliance energy models that are happening before the building's built, you're going to need to model same on baseline and proposed infiltration.
Very solid. Thank you, John. Another question for Phoebe. Do incentives need to be based on the city approved model, or can we incorporate additional lighting credit after the electrical permit?
Excellent question. And the answer is we only use the results that have been approved by SDCI, and we don't accept revisions. City Light sometimes modifies the results in the past when sometimes the code baselines seemed overly generous. We would be a little bit more parsimonious. But yeah, we don't accept modifications. And don't feel too bad about this lighting judgment, because really the intent was to get away from funding lighting at this point. It's the decision that was made, but that's an excellent question.
Kind of in a similar note there, Phoebe, are the City Light incentives for total building performance required to be based on the building permit energy model reviewed, approved by SDCI, or would it be possible to submit a post-permit model update after the electrical permit to Seattle City Light to claim lighting credit that wasn't included in the building permit modeling? It's one of a similar
yeah, and it's the same answer. Another really good question. No, it's the model that's approved by SDCI.
And question from Telemann Gasanov. Is this energy model compliance workbook available for use? Where can it be found?
John, can you take him back to the?
Yeah, if you go back, let's see, if we go back here, there are these two spots to find it. And the Seattle Energy Code website is just going to link back to the energycodes.gov website. And also just Googling Appendix G compliance form, it should pop up first, I think, but this Energy Codes website.
And then once you get into that, it's not really that obvious where the Seattle one is hiding, right?
Once you get into the Seattle Energy Code website link.
Once you get into the DOE thing, then you have to click on something to get yourself into the Seattle one in particular, right?
It's all the same workbook, so you just need to download the two files. It will kind of come together like this, and you'll open this 90.1 section 11 Appendix G file, and then on that first tab, right here, you'll change it over to Seattle Energy Code. So it's like one of the first drop downs for the workbook.
So that's where you have to get to Seattle instead of the regular Appendix G.
Yeah. So everyone's using the same workbook, but this drop down right at the beginning is what puts you into Seattle mode versus Washington mode versus just 90.1 mode.
Awesome, guys. Note. Thank you for all this. Don't see any other questions coming in. There was one or two rather technical ones in the past that we can like to address offline. As we move on, if I see any other questions, I may call them out. But for now, looking to start signing us off here, guys. Again, really good ton of information. Duane, John is great. Phoebe, very interesting on the Seattle City Light incentives. Well, I'll ask this last question that's coming in, and I'll ask it, answer it. Will SDCI review or allow exceptional calculations for regulated energy for appliances?
For regulated energy for appliances? I'm trying to think of what appliances are regulated energy. I'm thinking the answer is no, but if they can just contact me.
More so like Energy Star appliances, Duane.
Well, that's typically not regulated, and in fact, it's except for apartment buildings, they're not even there when the building inspectors come through. So in general, you can't use unregulated stuff to claim savings because we don't have a defined baseline from which we're working.
Very solid. Just asking for clarification here, Duane. The C412 trade-off, meaning altering the BPF, is that what you're referring to when you say C412 trade-off? Altering the BPF?
Well, there's a couple ways you can deal with C412. You can just put your solar panels on the roof, or yes, you can have a slightly better building performance factor, but doing some other things above code, or you can arrange to give away your solar to an affordable housing project. So all those options are on the table.
Very, very nice. Last one I'll address, and then yeah, I'll close this up after this. Is the tool going to be adopted for documenting model assumptions for lead projects?
No. I don't foresee that. We were really lucky that PNNL had funding from the Department of Energy, that they were willing to come in and do this very extensive and expensive work to set up these compliance forms for us. So to do further work would have to come up with some further funding source.
Awesome. No, thank you for the clarification. All right, guys. I think we're gonna have to call it here, give a few minutes back into our lives. So for now, just looking to say, hey, if you've enjoyed this content, we have upcoming webinars from the Lighting Design Lab website as well. Right now we have for the next following weeks, we're gonna have a commercial heat pump water heating deep dive. It is going to be a 4-part series going over design, operations, and maintenance. Solid content if you're looking for just commercial heat pump water heater knowledge, a good amount of information on products, sizing, design considerations. Yeah, no, we held it last year. It was a good amount of content, a lot of questions, and a lot of interaction. So please plug in. Again, look at the website there, lightingdesignlab.com, if you have interest. Go on the next slide, please.
We're trying to get them to change their name to the Heat Pump Design Lab, but so far no.
Name change pending. But yes, if we go on to the next slide, just calling out, if you get the handout, you're going to see my contact information. If you have any questions on recording, slides, content, reaching out to the panelists. And you'll also see Duane Jonlin's info if you don't have it already. And just the way it looks, hey, we'll have the recording and slides and our education as well as the resources tab. Any, again, questions or comments, please feel free to give us an email. You'll see our email in the bottom right, lightingdesignlab@seattle.gov. And I'll say that for all of us, if you want to go to the last slide, John, that is it for everybody. Thank you. Please answer the survey as you head out, see how the experience is. If you want to further engage, feel free to email us and we can answer any questions offline or get you connected to the right place. All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.